Moin, and welcome back to the second part of our Chapter 5 Market Structure and Firm Performance, comparing the different market structure. We have been looking at the market structures in part 5.3, and we had first differentiations between those, especially in class. After the video, we discussed and we brought forward some examples for these different market structures. Today, we are in the other extreme. After having discussed perfect competition in the last video, we are here at monopoly. Looking at the table of contents, basically chapter 5.5, and it will be a bit of the others mentioning some topics, but basically this chapter is about monopoly and the different aspects that we have, the different points of view in direction of monopoly. The role that a monopoly plays in a market economy. Is it basically bad because typically we have a bad image of a monopolist, high prices and a lot of market power, but does it play a role in market economies? These are questions that we are going to address in this chapter. We ended in our presentation and in the book, or the presentation here in slide 25, that we took as an outlook at the end of our last video, saying what is a monopoly? And these are the basic definitions: one firm, little if any close rivals, and large entry barriers. That's a definition sort of that leaves a firm in the situation of being a monopolist. Entry barriers, which means that it's either impossible or very hard for other firms to enter this market, so the monopolist stays alone. What are types of entry barriers? We have some here are listed: licenses, patents, and economies of scale. Often and basically it's technological advantage, that a firm has a better and more efficient production technology, or that they have a better product that the others didn't copy up to now, weren't able to copy because of licenses, patents. And one example that is frequently used is the so-called natural monopoly, which is based on economies of scale. Let's have a look at this first example of a monopoly and of an entry barrier, the natural monopoly. Our book, page 121, take this as an invitation to, from time to time, also have a look there, defines the different aspects of monopoly. And when it comes here to natural monopoly, you see the example: consider long-run average costs, like introduced, like we discussed in chapter 3. Long-run average costs that are going down because the fixed costs are very high. Our book describes this and gives us some examples like utility markets, water, gas, telecommunication, general infrastructure, transport. These are examples for natural monopolies. Situation where you have a huge setup cost. Think about a water infrastructure where all the pipes and all the necessary infrastructure has to be there. Or think about the railway of a country, where basically, first of all, you need to put all the tracks in every part of the country, then invest in all the trains. And only once you have this, then you can start selling your product or selling your service, and start looking at, for example, average costs, where we said the average cost change with the size, with the quantity distributed. And then we can have a look there. Let's stick to the railway example. When we put the output, in this case the kilometers or the passenger kilometers over a time period, over a year or something like this, in relation to the costs, and in this case directly the average cost. If the setup cost is that high, and imagine the train system of a country, you will have several billions here, might be a three-digit billion number, even to start. And then when you start selling the first kilometer, the first person uses this railway. This first person had average costs of these 500 billion. If you have the typical example or the typical calculation that we did with average costs, if you have 1,000 customers, then it's substantially lower. And if you have millions of customers, like you have with the railway, and you compute not only millions of customers, but customer kilometers, then you go up to billions again. And the more customers you have, the more kilometers that you sell, the lower your average cost will be. We talked about average costs that are U-shaped, that go up at some time. That might happen here as well. But let's say this is not in the relevant area. But the kilometers that are demanded might be this, 100 million kilometers per specific time unit. If they are offered by one firm, then we will have a specific average cost. So let this be million of passenger kilometers, and if there is a demand of 100 million passenger kilometers, we could go up here and see there is an average cost of 20 cents per kilometer. If there is one firm. If we have two firms, then in fact both would be here in the middle and produce and offer both 50 million of passenger kilometers. So the average cost that both firms have are double as high as compared to the average cost of one firm, of a monopolistic firm. And we could continue here. If we have four firms, then they all supply 25, and you can see that the average cost goes up substantially. And so on. If we go further ahead, then the prices increase even more dramatically. Which means that the lowest average cost that we can achieve and that we want to achieve, we want that public transportation by train is as cheap as possible, that this can only be achieved by having only one firm that produces the whole amount of 100 million person kilometers. And that is a monopoly, typically in such situation as utility firms granted by a government, sometimes, or it used to be, historically, it used to be public firms that belonged to the government. This changes. In some countries they are privatized, in other countries they are not. But it's one firm, and then of course we have to take care that this one firm that automatically has a lot of power doesn't misuse that power. So what we need are, in this situation, government regulations that sets the framework for these firms, how they operate, what they have to offer, with which consumers they are obliged to work together in a government regulation. So I just copied the slide so that we have all the information here for the natural monopoly. Please keep in mind that the natural monopoly is just one extreme example. Monopolies can have different reasons. We saw this, or we still see it here: licenses, patents, or just technological advantage, products that only one firm knows how to produce, and so keeps the market closed. So let's move on from the natural monopoly, which is just one example, to the general situation of a monopolist or of a monopolistic firm. When we analyze monopoly, we at the end think about profit maximization, and in fact we're going to go one step further and analyze the welfare effect of a monopoly versus a competitive situation. But start at the beginning, talking about the revenue and the cost. First figure here, figure 510, monopolies, marginal and average revenue, with a contemporary example. Have a look at this figure. We might guess, or we might talk about it together. This figure has, if not an error, then something that is not precise, and with this figure we can't really work, but let's draw it on our own. Within this sequence, let's first of all talk about average revenue, marginal revenue, then at average marginal cost, at least to analyze the profit maximum, and then we know that we needed the average cost in order to compute the actual profit. But the most important thing is to think about this profit maximization and the quantity that results. Recall what we just did in the last video and in other chapters. Average revenue is this downward sloping function, is at the end the demand function from point of view, interpreted from point of view of the firm. So average revenue is A minus B times Q. And we take the same example, the same methodology as we used in the first part of our video, saying average revenue, which is represented by the price, is A minus B times Q. So let's directly take numbers, 500 minus 50 times Q. Next step, we are going to draw this. Those who want to try, whether they understood, might stop the video here, draw, and then check whether you come to the same drawing or not. Starting point is obviously 500 minus 50 times Q. So in order to know where it intersects down here, we have to always ask the question, 500 minus 50 times what is 0? And that is 10. And we, of course, think about a scale that is in thousands. So these are 2,000, 4,000, and so on. But we just make it a bit easier with the numbers. That is average revenue. Now, again, the next question, repeating the last video, if this is average revenue, how does marginal revenue look like? What is, on the one hand, the formula for marginal revenue? Again, with the question mark, and if you want to think about it, what is the formula? If you want to review, stop and then continue watching at the moment where you wrote something here. Yeah, what are the numbers and so on. We continue. We said if AR is A minus B times Q, then MR is A minus 2B times Q. That was this to be or not to be question that we have to solve here. For those who don't recall exactly this difference between to be or not to be, go back one video, go back to the last Miro board, and then here in the very first frame we had this discussion where we went away from average revenue, saying what is then total revenue, derived total revenue, and there we came to this different AR and MR. So that's what we know, and that's what we now can use and can write down. So double the slope, it will be MR is 500 minus 100Q. And as the slope has double the value, negative slope, that means that it's steeper and it intersects at half. Here it intersects at 10 and this intersects at 5. So much basically the same analysis as we did before. Now, what about the costs? The correct sketch of a marginal cost curve would be something like this. And also our book takes such a shape. You find this analysis in figure 5.11. But we take an easier function. In fact, the total cost might be equal 500 plus 25Q squared. Hopefully you don't think easier with a squared. The point is that we need not the total cost, but we need the marginal cost. And if total cost is 500 minus 25Q squared, and you take the first derivative, what is the marginal cost? What stays is the 500 goes away and the 2 sort of goes here, and you have 25 times 2, and that gives you a marginal cost of 50Q, which we can easily draw into our graph. And with this, we have the setup in order to look at our profit maximization in the case of monopoly. By the way, what is different to the analysis we had before? It's the fact that the firm is a monopolist. That this firm now is able to take the whole average revenue cost curve, which reflects the demand curve of the consumers, but that's all the demand for one firm. So this one firm can basically decide which amount do I want to produce, and then what do I have to do in order to bring the people to buy exactly this amount. And that's what we do now, finding the profit maximum by setting marginal revenue equals to marginal cost and check this in the graph. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost, so 500 minus 100Q equals 50Q. Again, take a break, solve, and check what is the profit maximizing quantity. So 500 minus 100Q is equal to MC 50Q. If you want, again, take a break and check whether you find the QM, the profit maximizing quantity, by solving this equation for Q. So 3.33 is our profit maximizing quantity at the point where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. So this point, and we can go down here in order to find QM. So this is the first part of the story, sort of about profit and the profit maximization of a monopolistic firm. At the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, they go down and they find this QM that we computed here, or that we can also see in the graph. So far, so similar to what we have been discussing generally. Now, what is the price that a monopolistic firm can get? And here comes the difference. You might recall that in a perfect competition, we had the demand and price function horizontal, and the firm in perfect competition cannot choose which price to take. This is different from a monopolist. And if they want to produce this quantity, 3.33 thousand, they could, of course, go over here and charge 180. But that wouldn't be in their interest, because at 180, the demand would be nearly 8,000. And this is not what the profit maximizing, or what the monopolist wants to produce. They want to produce 3,333. The next idea is to say, okay, but we have this average revenue curve represents also the plans of the consumers. It says at which price are we going to buy a specific amount, which means when we go from this intersection upward to the average revenue curve that also represents the demand, and then to the left, and we see here that will be something between 300 and 400, that is the price that makes the consumers, in fact, buy exactly this amount. And that idea was brought forward by a French economist. His name was Cournot. And Monsieur Cournot, described this, and let's also write this down. So when we say we go up to this curve geometrically, which we will do in a second, that analytically means we take the AR curve, 500 minus 50 times Q, and put QM in there, the 3.33 that we just computed. Thanks to Monsieur Antoine Cournot. What we do, we go from QM up until we come to the AR curve. And this point over there, we call the Cournot point. So thanks to Monsieur Cournot, we now know the price that belongs to the profit maximization of the monopolistic firm. So 333.3 here is the monopolistic price. At that point, we could follow the same analysis, the same story that we did in the first half. We know now that we are able to compute the profit by finding, or by taking the average cost in account. And if we put this average cost into our diagram around this, we would see that we have below the costs and that we have above the revenue. And that means that here in this area, we are going to find the profit. As I said, we don't keep this rough sketch here. If you want to check this, go to figure 5.1. Here you have this analysis at the point where this quantity intersects the average cost curve. We can draw these rectangles in order to compute that. That's also interesting if we want to compute the average, the profit. But we have something different that we want to do next. We analyzed now last video, the perfect competition. Now we talked about monopolies as the two extremes of the market structure. And let us have a look at what does that mean for us, for consumers, or what does it mean for the society, the welfare of the society, whether we have a monopolistic situation or a competitive situation. For this analysis, to answer this question, we reproduced our graph in the next frame. And the first idea or the first approach is to say, let's compare the quantity and the prices. So compare this QM and PM with the situation in perfect competition. So that would be QE and PE. How to find them? So we're interested in the equilibrium, and we recall from chapter 3 that this equilibrium is found at the point where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, where these two functions intersect. Where is quantity demanded and quantity supplied in our diagram? Now we have to recall what we said about the supply curve, how the supply curve is derived in chapter 3. And we found out that at the end, quantity supplied is represented by the marginal cost curve. You might review if you want to do this. And we said here the average revenue, that downward sloping curve, is at the end the firm's interpretation of the demand curve. So AR represents quantity demanded. And then we have our equilibrium at the point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. That is the equilibrium. The situation that we would observe if there was a perfect competition. If we take the functions that we know from the left frame, marginal cost was 50Q and average revenue is 500 minus 50Q. Sorting this, we come to 100Q equals 500, or Q is 5, QE, the equilibrium quantity. Based on which we can also find the price, as we take one of the price equations, 500 minus 50Q, 500 minus 50 times 5 gives us the equilibrium price. 5 and 250s, two values that we can also see here, a quantity of 5 and a price of 250. We can also show this geometrically in our graph. It was even easier to compute as these are even numbers, 5 and 250. Welfare. What is meant here with welfare? We might recall that in the meantime we used different definitions of welfare. The first one that we have been using at the very start, when we basically said what is it that we want to do, was this with allocation and distribution target. It said as many as possible of the desired goods as the allocation target, and to distribute these goods as equally as possible, which we could translate in a direction that as many people as possible can afford these goods. So let's compare the quantity and the price. And when we look at this, it's relatively obvious. The quantity in equilibrium is bigger than the quantity in monopoly. And here the price in monopoly is bigger than the price in perfect competition. From this first, we could refer to the allocation target and say, obviously, in equilibrium, there are more goods produced, and we define this as better if there is more available for the people in an economy. I wrote down higher quantity in PC in perfect competition, but generally in competition, if we are not in a monopoly situation, but if there is a bid competition, we will always observe the quantity is higher, and that is better from our allocation point of view. From the distribution point of view, it's better if the price is smaller, and this is also here the case. So a smaller price, which means that goods are more and better affordable by people in PC again. So we can say the first step of our comparing the two situations, monopolistic and perfectly competitive situation from a welfare point of view, we come to a result that the perfect competition is better applying the rules, the targets that we set up at the beginning of our class. And this first approach was titled Quantity and Prices, and then applying these rules that we have been using. Second approach, welfare as consumer and producer surplus. So something we have been discussing in chapter 2, we talked about the consumer surplus, that is sort of from point of view of the consumers, from our point of view, that the firms are not always able to charge really our willingness to pay, but that due to the market mechanism, we have some consumer surplus, and we already learned and discussed that the firms try to exploit this consumer surplus, take it away as far as possible. Anyhow, we can use this tool of consumer surplus here also to measure what is it that is this surplus, so that after the transaction in equilibrium or in monopoly stays as an extra for us, for consumers, but also the equivalent thing for producers after the transaction. And also this we do in a graphical way. So I'm going to reproduce that graph and then introduce the consumer and producer surplus as we are used to it, as we learned it in chapter 2. And we reproduce the graph in order to have the one up there intact. So you can see, okay, what did we do there? And now compare it with the analysis of consumer surplus. And let's recall, consumer surplus was defined as the willingness to pay minus the actual price. So what we said is that at the end, what we look at here are all the consumers sorted by their willingness to pay. So here sort of the consumers are allocated and are sorted by the willingness to pay. On the left, the one with the highest willingness to pay, to the right. And this person with the highest willingness to pay would have paid 500 for that good, but at the end, he only has to pay 250 in perfect competition. And similar for the next person, she was willing to pay 499, only has to pay 250, has a surplus of 249, the next person has a surplus of 248, and so on. That was this triangle that we found and that we defined as consumer surplus. Now we can do the similar argumentation and say the same holds at the end for producers. Producers have the willingness to pay, and we already said in class, this is just to make things easier. Normally the supply curve starts a bit higher. But let's say here for 1 year, there was one producer who had the product, we don't know from where, but he obviously was willing to sell it for €1, but he receives 250. So he is going to have a surplus of 249 again. The next person 248, and so on. So what we do in this operationalization, this type of measurement of welfare, is we define welfare as consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And we are just seeing the situation in perfect competition. Now, what is the situation in monopoly? We perhaps have to zoom in a bit and check this. In monopoly, the price is 333, and so substantially higher than the price of 250, which means that the consumer surplus for this first person is no longer 249, but only the difference between 500 and 333, so 167, 66.66. And so on, all the others are going to be limited to this upper triangle. That is the consumer surplus in the monopolistic situation. in case of the producer surplus, it's the other way around. The surplus here becomes bigger as now the price is 333, and that first supplier that was willing to supply for €1 now gets 333 euro. So she has a producer surplus of 332.33. And when we observe this and when we check this, we see that we come at the end to a producer surplus in monopoly that looks like this. So on our first view, we see that the producer surplus became bigger and the consumer surplus smaller, which means it's a redistribution from the consumers to the producers. We, the consumers, get less and the producers earn more, make a higher profit or make a higher producer surplus here. But we see something else, because there is the question, what about this area? It wasn't looked at before, and that makes sense because it doesn't belong here. We only have a quantity of 3.33, so that part no longer exists, that part of consumer surplus. And if we measure consumer surplus, if we measure welfare via consumer surplus and producer surplus, this is less welfare. We have a welfare loss of this triangle where the question mark now is we are going to sketch it. And we can write down the results that we just got, similar to this, to what we did up there, and come to the answer, what is a better situation from point of view of welfare. So we wrote down what we already said. Consumer surplus is bigger in equilibrium, in perfect competition, but the producer surplus is bigger in monopoly. So we have a redistribution from the households to the firms, which makes perfect sense. That is what we observe on an everyday basis. If we have firms who make specific goods, computers, and they are in a competition, and this computer might be sold for a specific price for 500, and then there's another firm who prints a banana on the computer and people are willing to pay 3 or 4 times the price, then this firm is not a complete monopolist because there are different markets, but obviously they are able to sell the same, more or less the same good for a higher price, and that means that this firm earns quite a lot of money with that. And we observe a welfare loss, so the welfare in the society as a whole is smaller. And that sort of goes back, we could say, to the allocation target or the argument we brought forward up there, that it is good in our definition to have a lot of goods because then we can distribute them to the people. If we have fewer goods, in this case here only 3,300 instead of 5,000, less can be distributed and the welfare is lower. So after several graphs and analysis and concepts that we looked at, we can do this conclusion: welfare is higher in competition, the highest in perfect competition, and that means there should be regulations to prevent monopolies and to promote free competition. Which brings us back to the very start of our class, where we compared market failures, and the first market failure that we discussed was in fact market power. And already there we said the government should institute laws and institutions that forbid market power, that try to limit market power, that try to limit cartels. That's the other situation, not one firm, but several firms working together, a topic that we are going to address in the next chapter, chapter 6. But yeah, here we went deeper into the analysis and came to this conclusion that basically said competition is better, we should avoid monopolies. But is that always really and anytime like this? Our book compares the two situations of perfect competition and monopoly from different viewpoints. Let us copy this to our board, then we can zoom a bit. And this is the point where I'm looking forward to our class discussions. What are the advantages and disadvantages of monopoly and perfect competition? And yes, there are disadvantages of perfect competition. So we have these differentiations here. This is purely definition where we see, for example, the homogeneous product and the perfect information. Everyone knows everything, but also different types of analyses. One is that in the long run, in monopoly, there will be supernormal profits, and in perfect competition, these supernormal profits are going to be competed away. We have an efficient price equal to the marginal cost, and we have a higher price in monopoly. We have high market power, which leads to these high prices and low quantities. But can there be disadvantages of perfect competition? That is our first task that I'm going to discuss with you in class. So feel invited to have to think about this aspect. So you already know our green bubbles here that gives you tasks, that give us tasks in order to prepare, in order to do in class together as teamwork. And that will be sort of after we answered your questions. And I hope that there are questions about these different concepts and graph and so on. I could understand if it's not that sort of easy to get what we did there and why and what the message is, although the message we wrote down relatively clearly, but what are the steps in between? Feel free to ask at any time, you know. But then we going to work on this, on the application of this theory, and one is advantages and disadvantages of perfect competition v monopoly. I wrote down some sketch words here, but with which other aspects come to your mind. So this is totally free, and we're going to spend some time with this. And another concept, which is called creative destruction. What is creative destruction about? Research the concept and perhaps find out about this guy, Joseph Alois Schumpeter. What does he do? What did he do? How is he related to our discussions that we do here? That was our analysis about chapter 5, second part, the other extreme of the market structures, monopoly. We have things to discuss in class. And by the way, recall that also our book and our presentation always gives us some information, gives a summary at the end of each chapter. And you find this summary also on the last slide. How do firms maximize profit? What are possible and potential barriers to entry, marginal revenue, draw a diagram, and so on. You can see here several things. Most of them we did. We didn't go into the last ones. And there are always exercises. At the end of each chapter, there are exercises. There are exercises at the end of the presentation. So if you want to prepare for our tests or just want to know more about, did I understand, did I get the message of what was discussed, then feel free, feel invited to contribute this in class. Looking forward to seeing you there. And then we discuss Chapter 5, Market Structure and Firm Performance in the 2 steps we did. Have a nice day.